Introduction. We have PowerPoint. This paper is about the history of memory in relation to aging the body and dementia. And while dementia has its own unique history, it's also a recent history, and yet memory is one of the oldest ideas in the world. Even if memory's history is neglected in the modern neurosciences, where it's reduced to only that which can be measured. Memory that's not measurable in the neurosciences is really not memory. And this unmeasurable memory, however, is embedded in the mysteries of human nature nonetheless, even though it's invisible in the clinics and laboratories and research centers of the mainstream neurosciences. So at the outset, here in another work, I'm curious about this gap between the long history of memory and the short history of dementia, and how the centuries filled this gap with imaginative and cosmic revelations about the place of memory in human life. And in particular, my aim here is to argue that there is a relevance to medieval society's ars memoria, or the art of memory, to dementia issues today. I find pre-modern sensibilities, even though I'm not a historian, fascinating, because they speak to us from a worldview that founds unity between the body and the mind, the soul, and memory. And given current criticisms that we all are aware of dementia culture today, the aim to restore the centrality of the body to person-centered care, I think such sensibilities invite revisiting, even though incredible centuries separate us from historical forms of consciousness. Frances Yates, you might know her book, The Art of Memory, in 1966, was an exciting rediscovery of memory and a vibrant cultural knowledge before it became the basis of a scientific field. And her collection of archival materials from the Renaissance, from ancient to Renaissance periods, reveals how seriously memory was studied in the past, even if, as she says, it is clear only a marginal subject, not recognized as belonging to any of the normal disciplines, having been omitted because it was no one's business. And the story of the art of memory, medieval art of memory, begins with Aristotle, to whom the first organization of memory is credited. He wrote a terrific book called On Memory and Reminding Oneself. Aristotle devised a way of thinking about memory that endured until the Enlightenment. It was based on a series of exercises that involved the superimposition of one set of images over a set of places, so that in your mind, as you visited each place, it became a symbolic part of a larger spatial order of recall. And the idea that you could run through a mental geography of places in a routinized order to evoke a memory would become a core framework of the ars memoria in medieval culture. And we still do this. We count on our fingers. We say in the first place, in the second place, in the third place. That all goes back to Aristotle. And most importantly, he posed questions that we still ask today, such as what really is remembered in memory? How is memory physical, emotional, and ecological, and spiritual? Is memory loss a normal or an abnormal human condition? How do we distinguish accurate from inaccurate memories? All questions he asked, and I think important ones we're still asking. From Aristotle onwards, thinkers posed memory as an act of the imagination, like words etched into a wax tablet, which was a famous ancient metaphor. So you could etch in like an Etch-a-Sketch and then reuse and erase. And memory could be kept sufficiently soft also for endless impressions. Memory was also conceived, and this is my main interest, as a physical property affected by somatic conditions that together with mind and soul interacted with material flows and forces. So the Aristotelian art of memory as a kind of soul work, really, could be affected by heat and light and diet and behavior and environment, sleep and fluids and exercise. And it was a kind of somatic psychology of memory, where memory needed nurturing as well as training. And most importantly, age was not detrimental to memory health. Memory could also be symbolically inscribed and expressed by bodies, animal bodies, magical bodies, as kind of condensed templates of retrievable texts and prayers, parables, poems, and stories. And later medieval culture used the hands in particular as a kind of computational, calendrical, musical, and even spatial cognitive map. Here's an example of the hand as a mirror of salvation, and all the points on the hand having that kind of symbolic mapping. In fact, here's another system, Pacioli's finger reckoning system of 1495. You can figure this out, God bless you. But we still use our hands as memory devices, as symbolic devices, sometimes on the highway when we're mad at someone, but also in many other ways. So the body embodied memory and expressed memory as well. In medieval culture, the art of memory became a particularly important scholastic project for the Christian clergy. Historian Mary Carruthers has a fascinating book called The Book of Memory, and where she talks about good memory being based on not how something is communicated, but what happens since one receives it. And this is kind of interesting because modern models of memory consider mistakes to be a problem of accuracy in recall. In medieval culture, mistakes were a result of improper imprinting at source, like trying to be mentally greedy by remembering too much, too fast, which is exactly what we're encouraged to do in our culture, would be considered a problem in medieval culture. If you remembered wrongly at source, then you would have memory problems. So the art of memory insisted that memory training should be based under favorable conditions where the material was received and embodied in the first place. Input mattered as much as output. For the clergy, whose craft of public oratory, sermons, preaching was an art in itself, recalling textual authority through proper technique was key to religious performance. So again, memory was somatic. Clergy were advised, for instance, to sub-vocalize when they read and to murmur because it opened up the body, to murmur and whisper, be excited when you read, even advised to eat and drink while reading in order to be physically receptive to the text memory. In fact, there are prescriptions for rubbing certain herbs into your head to open up your mind when you're trying to remember something. Opening up your body was key to remembering accurately. Books were to be read digestively through rumination, chewing over pages in one's mind. Augustine considered memory, he called it the stomach of the mind. So medicine and diet on the one hand and mental images on the other provided a kind of rich experience for the art of memory. Books were to be therefore animated through sight and color and noise and tactility and spiritualizing dialogue when one read in order to be inventive about input. Libraries were also organized as kind of memory maps. As you walk through libraries, you were encouraged to develop a confluence between your body and mind, between things and words, and spaces, and literacy, and micro and macro orders. And that's why Carruthers considers the fact in medieval culture that we shouldn't be talking about ethical rules. It would be better to speak of ethical memories, having the right kind of memories. Since ethical memories guided your journey through the wheels of life by embodying what had been seen, heard, felt, and read. So this great dialogue between physiological, sensual, literary, and mental processes that went into remembering was an imaginative skill that created your own images and your own narratives in unpredictable and joyous ways. And indeed, the sense of sensual joy of the art of memory that's often hidden in the weighty prescriptions on how to remember is probably its most overlooked aspect. But joy is one of the great principal supports by which memory is strengthened in medieval culture. Here's a little quote from Da Signa, a medieval teacher of rhetoric and philosophy at the University of Bologna. And I think it speaks to that sense of joy in remembering. Let the intellect of him who wishes to remember rejoice, because rejoicing strengthens the ability to remember. Let him who is going to remember enjoy the freedom he has longed for, because the constraint of one's will does great harm. Let him enjoy fresh air and free air, fresh and free air, because the container changes the contained. Let the diet be tempered, etc., etc., and especially stop now and then in delightful and pleasant spots, in which one may hear nightingales and sweet-sounding running of brooks. What a joyous kind of image that's associated with memory, full of light and pleasure and fragrance and sweet sounds, sea foam and breezes, with no hint that memory would become a source of victimhood and disease that would develop in the modern era. The secularization of memory was also transformed into a secular regime in the Renaissance period, where we had a resurgence in the occult and hermetic ideas on cosmological models of the body and spirit. These are a couple of quick examples. Robert Flood, Guiglia Camillo were imaginative thinkers in the Renaissance who portrayed symbolic theaters in which doors and columns and stages and props and entrances were symbolic sites to unite the mind and memory with the macro celestial world. In other words, these were symbolic theaters in which you were supposed to travel through and visit your memories and have them imprinted. These are also very beautiful artistic images. I like Flood's image of the guy blowing his mind here, bubbling out into the cosmos. If this was 1968, it would be an acid trip, just a beautiful. Yeats comments that Flood's system, she said, was hitched to the stars, and I think that is a perfect example of that. At the same time, the art of memory was elaborated in these very imaginative and magical ways. However, scientific and humanistic ideas about the mind and body began to reject as fanciful metaphysics and cosmological utopias. Particular importance has been credited to Descartes, who I think has been wrongly blamed for dividing mind and body, but nonetheless, he did seek a reordered relationship between mind, soul, body, and memory. And here's a model of his neurophysiological mechanism of the mind within the body, showing its kind of primitive pathways and flows. He assumed connected things like glands and animal spirits, substances, and reflexes. Descartes, in other words, separated mind and body as different categories, but I don't think there was some pre-modern enchanted whole that he actually rendered asunder by doing that. Other contemporaries of Descartes, such as Robert Hooke and Thomas Willis, saw memory now as brain functions in the 17th and 18th century. Willis's book, Cerebral Anatomy, was part of a modern perspective on the brain. He invented the term neurology in 1664 and the medical treatment of mental disorders themselves. But the main migration of memory from soul to mind was really, in my opinion, achieved by John Locke, who popularized the notion that memory was the guarantor of individual personhood, or more specifically, the guarantor of a rational, self-conscious, forensic person who was a new figure who arose from evolving practices of Enlightenment law and property and trade. Locke, in the sections of his book, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, great sections, one's called Of Retention, another one's called Of Identity and Diversity. And he makes it very clear that good memory structures successful identity. He says, where memory is wanting, all the best of our faculties are in great measure useless. And we, in our thoughts and knowledge, could not proceed beyond the present were it not for the assistance of our memories. He says, in case of memory defects, an interesting word he introduces, memory defects, including memory, he says, that moves too slowly and retrieves not the ideas it has, and that can result in, quite plainly, stupidity, he says. So Locke's idea that personhood is built on the continuity of personal identity and that forgetfulness, for once, interrupts the continuity of memory. Also, therefore, interrupts the continuity of personhood. And these Cartesian and Lockean diagrams then of personhood and memory and body make it possible now to disembody memory, to isolate it, and to therefore isolate the person to become a victim of faulty memory. It would take another 3 centuries, which of course I don't have time to go over, to develop modern brain sciences as we know them today. But we do have the beginning at this time of an obsession of Western thought with the universal vision of a cerebral personhood, whose chief attribute was a kind of rational, continuous, internalized memory that was laid down in the 17th and 18th century. We still live in the shadow of what Fernando Vidal calls Enlightenment's cerebral subject, a human figure based on a brain-person coupling of brainhood ideology that dissolved that older psychosomatic unity of the pre-modern world. As for the medieval art of memory, it still exists as a kind of quaint game of recall, revived from time to time by eccentric mentalists and circus performers. But its powerful unifying vision that memory could hold the world together was of course shattered by Enlightenment rationalism. Do I have any time left? Who's the moderator?
I'm moderator.
Yeah.
You still have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, good. Okay, this is it. So, what has been gained and what has been lost in conclusion? In the centuries following Descartes and Locke, the sciences of the brain and memory changed and advanced according, of course, to the priorities of new cultural moments, new technologies, and scientific models. And such movements emerged from various sources: 19th century brain localization research, Freud's work on psychoanalysis, Ebbinghaus's experimental memory psychology. All of these and others materialize the idea that memory was not only now an object of science, but key to understanding human nature itself. The 20th century began, of course, with the discovery of Alzheimer's disease, followed by all the research on amyloid plaques and tangles associated with it, and confirming the idea that there could be normal as well as abnormal brains based on memory function. My argument, though, has been about the relevance of a historical account of memory. However, it's not meant to imply that we revive the medieval art of memory or pre-modern or cognitive models, but I'm suggesting something different, which is that we consider the value of enriching our sciences with an account of how we got to be the sciences, of how the long history of memory became coupled to human meaning and identity in ways that eventually created our particular forms of cerebral subjectivity today. And I return to the beginning of the paper and ask again what we might learn from the past and apply it to the future. And on this last slide, I have 5 kinds of thoughts to leave us with around as a response. That first of all, memory might be considered more of an active agency and imagination, not simply a passive cognitive process of computerized input and output, and that our personal interpretations and images of the past can be and are expressed in creative, even fantastical ways that go beyond what can be measured. And they also include shaping our aging memories through forgetting and remembering. Second, that memory is a force that intersects not just us as people, but our environments and our world and our cosmic forces beyond us. It affects our communities and moves across collective activities. Memory is integrative rather than divisive. Third, that memory can be expressed on and through our bodies, our great symbolic resource for embedding and plotting our lives, even when our minds fail us. The memory health is affected by health in general. Fourth, that memory loss is not necessarily a disease, but a contingent condition of growing older. The cognitive status of older people is part of the cognitive status of all people at all ages, because memory is adaptable at all ages. And reducing older people to their brains and dehumanizing them as marginal in the name of cognitive care harms memory. And lastly, memory, as with other cognitive activities, is emotional, and as well as cerebral, because our brains are centers of feeling as well as cognition. And to separate the two means failing to understand memory as an art as well as a science. So, thank you for your attention. This project in part was supported by a CHR operating grant. There's a full version of this paper in the journal Dementia. That was 2014. That's just, aggrandizing self-promotion here to end the paper. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. you.